Well, welcome. Are we ready to start? Yeah. I'm Sharon Squassoni, and I direct the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to moderate this panel this afternoon, which is on reprocessing and disposal of spent nuclear fuel. We listened to a lot of the sort of high-flying politics of disarmament in the first session, and now it's time to get down to details. But as I'm sure many of you who are familiar with these issues know that it's not just technical details that have an impact on decisions about reprocessing and disposal of spent nuclear fuel. This is highly political in all different countries. There is another panel on this topic later in the program, and that is designed to focus on the handling of these issues in South Korea. So this panel is designed to look at experiences not completely around the world, but to give a slightly broader scope. And we are going to hear from Dr. Juhani Virra, first from Posiva Oy, who will talk about the Finnish experience. Dr. Virra is Vice President for Research at Posiva Oy in Finland, and he's worked on the long-term safety of geological disposal and also characterizing the Olkiluoto site. As you may know, Finland is closest of any country to citing a geologic repository. After Dr. Virra, we will hear from Andrew Orrell from Sandia National Lab, and he is the Director of Nuclear Energy Programs for that laboratory, and he's led the Repository Systems Program and completed the post-closure performance assessment portions for the Yucca Mountain license application. After Dr. Orrell, we will hear from Alan Hansen, to my left, who is currently a visiting fellow at Stanford University, but in a previous life, no, current life, you were at AREVA, and he's an expert in reprocessing. He also spent some time at the International Atomic Energy Agency as coordinator for the International Spent Fuel Management Program. And as well as he knows a lot about safeguards and non-proliferation policies. And last but not least, we will hear from Dr. Charles McCombie, who is president of ARIUS, which is the Association for Regional International Underground Storage, and also has a consulting firm, MCM Consulting. Charles was the technical director of NAGRA, which is the Swiss National Waste Management Organization, and he will be speaking about multinational repositories, and what else, Charles?
The interactions, yeah.
The interactions among, one of the things we want to look at here is storage, how decisions are made between storage, reprocessing, and disposal. So I am going to hand over the floor to Dr. Virra. We'll have a similar format as in the opening session. 10 minutes of presentations, and then we'll, per speaker, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So, Dr. Virra.
Okay, thank you, Sharon, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The first plans for spent fuel management in Finland was based on reprocessing, like the policy was, I guess, in most of the countries introducing nuclear power in the 1970s. However, certain events in the late 1970s and the early 1980s had the consequence that at the moment we are really approaching the licensing of a spent fuel repository, having not reprocessed any of the fuel that was planned to be reprocessed in the 70s. First, there was President Carter's decision to deter reprocessing in the U.S. and also to encourage other countries to follow the same policy. Second important thing was the 3 Mile Island accident that caused the uranium prices to drop quickly and dramatically in the early 1980s. Although none of these directly affected us, they certainly had an impact on the uranium market. They certainly also impacted the way the countries considered their future policies as regards the reprocessing. In this situation, the Teollisuuden Voimat TVO company, whose concern the spent fuel management mostly was in Finland at that time, decided not to sign any reprocessing agreement with any of the reprocessors, but instead start preparing for direct disposal of spent fuel in Finland. The government of Finland at that time was in fact against such policy because they certainly preferred the kind of arrangement that the other nuclear company, IVO, had already in place in Finland. Their spent fuel went back to the Soviet Union according to an agreement between the governments of Finland and the Soviet Union. And the government wanted that TVO should seek for similar arrangements for their spent fuel. But the government soon accepted that such arrangements, such services were not available for TVO. And so in 1983 they made a decision. They made a decision in principle how TVO should prepare for spent fuel disposal, what sort of time schedule they should follow in their preparations for direct disposal in Finland. And in fact, later in 1994, the Nuclear Energy Act was changed in Finland, and after that, direct disposal of spent fuel became the only alternative in practice for spent fuel management in Finland. Now it's Posiva who's in charge of spent fuel disposal in Finland, but it's still basically the same decision of 1983 that we are following, with the same time goal for starting the disposal. If all goes well, we will start disposing of spent fuel in 2020, and that means that we might be among the first to start operating a repository for high-level waste or spent fuel. Well, the basis of TVO's decision in the 1980s was mainly economical, but other aspects were effective as well. First, of course, we were not thinking of buying reprocessing services from the US, so that was not the direct impact of Mr. Carter's decision. But still, it had indirect effects on the market, nuclear fuel supply market, because many countries then started putting various restrictions on their supply of nuclear fuel cycle services. For example, Canada did that. So a prior consent was needed, for example, for pre-processing of spent fuel that originated from their services. And that, of course, was kind of a risk for a small company that was completely dependent on foreign fuel cycle supplies. Another thing was that a number of comparisons and assessments were made about the pros and cons of once-through and reprocessing fuel cycles, but as to their environmental effects and safety risks. But none of these truly came to any conclusive results, because usually the results, the outcome of the comparison, depended on how the balance was struck between current and future impacts and risks. And the same thing also applied for the consideration of proliferation risks from these fuel cycles options. Again, the outcome was dependent on how much emphasis was given on current benefits and on future benefits in that respect. So TVO started their route towards direct disposal in Finland. But I think that the success, to the extent we've had success so far, could not have been possible without our neighbors in Sweden. There, in response to political pressures, the SKB had already in the late 70s started an extensive RTD program on direct disposal, and by 1982 they had developed the now famous KBS3 concept. Because our geologies in Finland and Sweden are much the same, very similar, and our fuels were the same at the time, it was quite natural for TVO to adopt the KBS3 concept so they could draw on the research and development work already done in Sweden and instead concentrate on the siting process. Siting was already then considered a probable issue, and to prevent that issue from becoming an obstacle for the program, a systematic, stepwise program for siting was launched in the mid-1980s. It put the emphasis first on the geological factors and safety-related factors, but let the public decide in the end, both locally and nationally. And it seems that that approach worked. 10 years ago, we were the first country to choose to have an approved site for a repository for high-level waste in Finland. That decision, that siting decision, also meant that we could, and in fact should, start constructing an underground rock characterization facility, which we did in 2004. The facility called the Onkalo is now almost ready. We have a tunnel reaching down to the depth of 420 meters. We have 3 shafts already as deep, already almost there as well. So what in fact is missing are the encapsulation plant and the actual repository tunnels. And for them, we first, of course, need a construction license. And now the situation is that we are preparing to submit the license application next year, at the end of next year. SKB in Sweden already submitted their application for construction license of a similar repository in Forsmark, Sweden. But because their licensing procedure probably will take more time, because they still have the political debate in front of them, and also because they've not started any excavations yet at Forsmark, it's probable that they are not ready yet by 2020. It will take somewhat longer, perhaps by 2025, until they are ready to operate their repository. There's a third country in Europe as well preparing for licensing now a high-level waste repository. That's France, where there is a law that says that they have to start disposing of high-level waste by 2025. And it seems that on the basis of the present situation in France, that goal is still realistically achievable. Well, the 1983 decision has been re-evaluated and discussed every now and then in Finland. But it seems that at the moment there is a rather good consensus that some sort of geological repository will be needed. Of course, there are concerns about the long-term safety, but I guess that quite many people nowadays agree that there are no good alternatives to geological repositories available. There are advocates of reprocessing still. In Finland, for example, the Director General of our regulatory agencies is a strong advocate of reprocessing. However, our position at Posiva is that in any case we will need a geological repository, whether it'll be for reprocessing waste, high-level reprocessing waste, or spent fuel. And in fact, we believe that even if we opt for reprocessing in the future, there will still be some spent fuel that will have to go for direct disposal as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Juhani. If I can just pose a few questions right now. What has Finland spent on this program so far, and how much do you think the total will be before fuel starts to go into that repository? And one thing I think when we look to Finland as an example, are there things, can your experience be as an American, I'm really curious, can your experience be replicated elsewhere? Are there things unique to Finland that can't be replicated either in the political structure or the way the debate was structured, or, for example, your willingness to take Sweden's technology and basically use it? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, Finland's stance, well, I think the stance was probably decided 10 years ago in the form of the so-called decision in principle, which is a kind of general license that was accepted locally in the Olkiluoto municipality. But of course, it's important that it also was gained almost a unanimous majority in the parliament. There was a vote, but only 3 were voting against. So the huge majority of something like 159 persons voted yes. So that was really a good political support for our plans to dispose of spent fuel. And of course, I think that there is a debate every now and then about whether that was a good decision or not. I think that the majority still accepts it because it seems there are no good alternatives available. So I'm not sure if this is what you asked, but this is, I guess, the Finnish stance still at the moment. So then about whether our model is somehow reproducible in other countries, I'm not sure. Of course, the fact is that the Olkiluoto site where we are going to construct a repository, it is a nuclear site. There are the nuclear power plants as well at the same site. And I think that that's something that seems to be a model that has been followed in Sweden. There again, the repository will be constructed on the nuclear power site, Forsmark. And I think similar plans are in other countries. France perhaps is a different example there. Bulle certainly has no nuclear activity, but still they are, I guess, proceeding there. So it's not the only possibility, but that seems like a workable possibility. But then about gaining the local acceptance, well, I think that may be easier in a small country and in a small local community than in some other bigger countries. Perhaps there are differences. I think not everything can be reproduced, but on the other hand, I think that what probably is a good example is that we've made it rather systematically. We've been able to hold on to stick to the system since from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And costs?
Costs. The costs of it all together. At the moment, I think the plans, what we've done, are for about 6,500 tons of uranium, and the corresponding cost of the repository is about 3 billion euros. But now, of course, we have plans for extending the repository, but I have no figures for the bigger version of the repository.
Thank you. We'll move on to the U.S. experience and issues with Andrew Orrell.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to comment quickly on the status of U.S. efforts in high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel management, including disposal, reprocessing, and storage. First, a quick history review. In 2008, with support from my own institution and myself personally, the Department of Energy submitted the license application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to seek technical review and regulatory approval to construct a repository at Yucca Mountain. Then we had an election, and we had a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress were swept into office. Immediately after being sworn in, the Obama administration moved to eliminate all funding for the project and suggesting that a new strategy was needed. In addition, the Department of Energy that had filed the license application in 2008 then moved to have it withdrawn, noting that it was the Secretary's judgment that not that Yucca Mountain is unsafe or that the application was flawed, but rather that Yucca Mountain is, quote, not a workable option and that alternatives will better serve the public interest, unquote. After a $10 billion investment, or thereabouts, repeatedly authorized by Congress since the site recommendation in 2002, the efforts to now cancel the program without a clear alternative in place caused a considerable reaction in Congress, in the industry, and in the public. There are legal suits by South Carolina and Washington states challenging the authority of the Department of Energy to take such actions. The Atomic Safety Licensing Board ruled that withdrawal of the license application was not authorized. There have been various inquiries and resolutions by congressional committees, trade group objections, etc. As a result, the Department of Energy Secretary, acting at the direction of the President, called for the formation of a Blue Ribbon Commission to explore these issues and to make recommendations on possible alternatives. By law, these commissions are limited to 2 years. They are to have a membership that represents a diversity of opinion and to operate with transparency and to seek public input. In short, the Blue Ribbon Commission formed into 3 subcommittees. The Disposal Subcommittee will address the question, quote, how can the U.S. go about establishing one or more disposal sites for high-level nuclear waste in a manner that is technically, politically, and socially acceptable? A pretty straightforward question. The Transportation and Storage Subcommittee will address the question, should the U.S. change the way in which it is storing used nuclear fuel and high-level waste while one or more final disposal locations are established? And finally, there's a Reactor and Fuel Cycle Technology Subcommittee, which will address the question, this is an important one, do technical alternatives to today's once-through fuel cycle offer sufficient promise to warrant serious consideration and R&D investment? And do these technologies hold significant potential to influence the way in which used fuel is stored and disposed? The draft initial subcommittee recommendations were released just last week. Among the many draft recommendations, there are a few key findings. One, a new entity, not the Department of Energy or other government agency, should be authorized to take charge of all transportation, storage, and disposal responsibilities. This is often referred to as a FedCorp approach. Two, the U.S. should proceed with the siting of a centralized, consolidated interim storage facility and simultaneously the initiation of a new repository siting program that is based in a volunteer, staged, adaptive management approach. Three, the U.S. should continue the research and development of advanced nuclear energy concepts, but they also explicitly argue that reprocessing, that there is no rationale for reprocessing at the moment. This last issue is probably the most disappointing to those who argue that reprocessing can provide several benefits. In a moment, I'll discuss some of those asserted benefits. So now what? What does this mean for the spent nuclear fuel management in the U.S.? We already have the world's largest inventory of spent nuclear fuel, with approximately 65,000 metric tons at present, and another approximately, or in total, 133,000 metric tons at the end of the existing fleet's 60-year life. And with at least some new build, perhaps 5 to 8 plants by the end of the decade, even more spent fuel will be accumulating. Will we have interim, indefinite, or permanent storage of this inventory? Is intergenerational nuclear guardianship acceptable? Will we reprocess and recycle, and if so, for what benefit and at what cost? Or will we pursue direct disposal, either in mined repositories or by deep borehole concepts? How might the U.S. face these questions? First, we must answer a fundamental question of whether the spent nuclear fuel inventory is an asset to be stored and exploited, or a waste to be disposed of. In the U.S., with the current debate over reprocessing versus disposal, regrettably the discussion often is posed as an all-or-nothing proposition. That is, store and reprocess everything, or zero reprocessing and all direct disposal. I suggest the true answer may be both, and for very practical reasons. I'll comment now on these 3 aspects of storage, reprocessing, and disposal. On the issue of storage, our inability to implement geologic disposal or reprocessing capability has led to a de facto interim and at present indefinite storage posture. We have not, and I do not expect, we will declare a nuclear guardianship policy of century-long storage before further action, much like the Netherlands have rightly done with their Habag facility. Due to the recent waste confidence decision, however, we do seem to be headed towards a default policy of century or more interim storage. The Blue Ribbon Commission has recognized this and the concerns over intergenerational equity, and has thus called for an expedited repository program to begin anew. On the issue of reprocessing, first let me recognize that reprocessing has real merit if energy security, the assured supply of fissile material, is a concern. And thus, in these situations, the economics of reprocessing have to be given some premium that might make it worthwhile. But in the U.S., with only 20% reliance on nuclear for the foreseeable future, an assured supply of fissile material is not a driver for the commercial industry, whereas proliferation concerns are a driver for U.S. policy. Regardless, in the U.S., reprocessing is often promoted as having various benefits primarily directed at the back end waste management and repository issues. For instance, reprocessing will reduce the volume, heat, and radiotoxicity of the waste, with the suggestion, sometimes explicitly stated, that doing so will at least simplify the existing repository effort, avoid a second repository, and somehow secure stakeholder acceptance. The adoption of new fuel cycles and/or reprocessing can certainly affect the volume and characteristics of the resulting waste, but cannot preclude the need for substantial geologic disposal of high-level and intermediate-level waste, nor, I believe, reduce the societal barriers to opening a repository. For example, not once has the state of Nevada suggested that only if the U.S. were to reprocess the spent fuel inventory, it would then allow Yucca Mountain to proceed. I mentioned that the debate over reprocessing versus direct disposal is often posed as an either-or proposition. Again, given the very large U.S. inventory, suggesting that reprocessing can erase this problem is perhaps wishful thinking. Some simple calculations can show that for all practical purposes, under most reasonable scenarios for nuclear generation and the potential availability and scale of reprocessing, even with significant reprocessing capacity beginning in the next 15 years, the backlog of spent nuclear fuel can never be practically consumed. Thus, at least some portion of the inventory has no reprocessing value whatsoever, and thus could be viewed as a waste appropriate for direct disposal now. One of the more common assertions about reprocessing is the reduction in radiotoxicity. Radiotoxicity of the waste form is widely used for evaluating the impacts of alternative fuel cycle options on the waste stream, but is not particularly useful for evaluating waste form or disposal system performance. Disposal system performance is evaluated and regulated on dose, not on radiotoxicity. Radiotoxicity is dominated by the actinides. The estimated dose from disposal of spent fuel is typically dominated by mobile fission and activation products. So even if you don't separate the actinides by reprocessing, they still don't affect repository performance. Another asserted benefit of reprocessing is the reduction in heat or volume of the disposal waste. Significant thermal benefits can be achieved if you also achieve substantial, greater than 99% separation of short-lived fission products, but these will also require extended storage. However, waste volume and thermal output are inversely related. Managing heat and volume is an engineering trade-off made in the repository design, and as evidenced by the several national programs pursuing direct disposal, as we just heard. Balancing heat and volume is readily achieved with direct disposal of spent fuel by combinations of aging, waste package loading density, emplacement density, or package spacing, and ventilation. Additionally, volumes of low-level waste will increase with reprocessing, including greater than Class C or intermediate level waste that may require geologic disposal as well, negating some of the volume benefit. And lastly, reprocessing has been promoted as extending the supply of uranium, which for some could address concerns over future uranium supply and availability, and hence provide some sense of energy security at some premium. However, perhaps in response to the price spike of uranium in 2007, exploration has increased substantially with a commensurate increase in global recoverable uranium resources. The latest estimates are that there are sufficient identified uranium resources to last another century. However, we recognize that available uranium resources do not mean the uranium is accessible to a particular program. and thus some programs may be willing to incur the economic premium that reprocessing demands for the assurance of energy security. On disposal and repositories, it seems we will be pursuing direct disposal for the foreseeable future. This may or may not be in concert with citing a consolidated interim storage facility. In either case, my colleagues have been giving the concept of deep borehole disposal more serious consideration as a practical, cost-effective means to effect high-confidence direct disposal in multiple locations to help address regional equity concerns. The outcome of the Yucca Mountain situation is far from over. It is possible the courts and the next Congress, after the 2012 elections, will renew the efforts to develop a repository at Yucca Mountain over the objection of the state of Nevada, but in compliance with current law. Regardless, I do not see the issue being resolved by Congress until well after the 2012 elections. In conclusion, each nation's energy policy and nuclear energy policy will dictate its approach to storage, reprocessing, and disposal. Smaller national programs, such as in Mexico or Slovenia, may benefit from direct disposal and to secure their fuel supply by other means. While on its face, reprocessing may not offer substantial benefits to the U.S. nuclear waste management situation, as the Blue Ribbon Commission also concludes. However, the world is an uncertain place, and even if we choose not to pursue reprocessing today, it may be prudent to develop a policy whereby we keep in strategic reserve some fraction of our spent nuclear fuel that could be reprocessed should the future need arise, and likewise direct dispose of the remainder. In this regard, we could develop a strategic spent fuel reserve with much the same intent as we maintain the strategic petroleum reserve. This reserve could be the long-term interim storage site with a fixed capacity that the host community would know could not be exceeded, moving fresher spent fuel in and older spent fuel out, thus keeping some economic activity at the site, and simultaneously the remaining fraction of spent fuel being moved to a repository site for direct and permanent disposal. All of this will entail our Congress to take action to change the laws now mandating a repository at Yucca Mountain, and to enact in law some of or all of the recommendations put forth by the Blue Ribbon Commission. Finally, you know you are in real trouble when you need to look to your Congress to take action. Thank you very much.
As someone who formerly worked for Congress, I can confirm that. One quick question. You mentioned something about, and I can't remember the exact words you used, something about reprocessing and equities. Were you, or was it the cost effectiveness of reprocessing? And are you suggesting subsidies in the United States?
No, I didn't touch on that. Was it the intergenerational equity issue
No,
or regional
it wasn't.
equity?
No, it was something about the. Yes.
Oh, the premium.
Right.
Yes. There's a hard cost of reprocessing. Whatever the actual physical cost of infrastructure, contracts, et cetera, are to reprocess. That does not entail the cost that you might associate, an intangible cost for energy security. So some countries that are willing to reprocess for energy security, that don't have natural uranium stocks, have anxieties about an assured supply, may and should be willing to assign a premium to that physical cost. So when we talk about the economics of reprocessing, we shouldn't think of just the hard cost. We should think of the hard and soft costs that go with getting energy security.
We can discuss that a little later because I think I have a different view than you do. But thank you for clarifying that. Alan, we'll talk a little bit more about reprocessing.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to Asan and to Sharon for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. The last time I was in Asia was a couple of months ago. I was in Kyoto, Japan, with a number of colleagues in the audience, and something happened there while our meeting was going on. I trust we won't have a similar event during the course of this conference. If that's the case, I'll stop coming to Asia. The subject of the session here is reprocessing and waste disposal. I'm going to focus pretty much on the reprocessing. I can probably shorten my presentation because Andrew has helped to clarify some of the issues already, and I agree with much of what he said. I should begin by saying that while I've spent most of my career with REVA and still remain an employee of Korea while on secondment to Stanford University, I am not here to make a sales pitch for reprocessing, and I am certainly not an advocate of everyone in the world embarking on a program to reprocess and recycle used fuel just because we do it in France. And in fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about why one might want to reprocess. And I agree very much with Sharon. We've had this discussion before that the worst possible reason to do it is for the prestige or to do it just because somebody else does it. This is the wrong reason. So I'm going to try to quickly run through a number of questions and talk about recycling. And the questions are all fairly fundamental. Why, how, when, and where. And so I'll try and touch on all of those, and I'll start with the why. And as Andrew has pointed out here, there are quite a few reasons that people might embark on a program of doing recycling. The first one usually mentioned is resource conservation. Because recovery of the unburned uranium and particularly the plutonium, there's a huge energy value in that, and it displaces the need to mine more virgin uranium and to do more enrichment. And the savings there are on the order of 25%, which is not a small amount. And when you realize that the largest environmental impact of nuclear power, at least absent accidents, comes from the mining, the reduction of mining does contribute to lowering both the environmental impacts and, very importantly, the secondary carbon generation associated with nuclear energy. Because while nuclear energy does not produce carbon in terms of its emissions, there are carbon dioxide emissions that come from both the mining operation and from the enrichment operation. This is the most impact on climate change that comes from nuclear. So if you take that into account, the conservation issues do have some importance. The second reason, and here I agree entirely with what Andrew said, that this is the question of energy security. And the way one can look at it, and the way some nations look at it, if you are not rich in uranium resources, and while uranium is pretty widespread, the best ores are not in the countries that are doing most of the generation of nuclear electricity. So most countries around the world are required to get their uranium from other countries, from foreign sources. If you're using a light water reactor and you're doing recycle, what you are doing is you are purchasing and using foreign uranium, but your reactor, your machinery, turns that into domestic uranium and domestic plutonium, because now it's yours. You own it, it's in your country, it's an energy resource. You don't have to go to a foreign country to get it. And so this is the security aspect which Andrew mentioned, and the reason that some countries are willing to spend a premium to do this. Because in fact, as he has already mentioned, and I will agree with him completely, the value of the recovered processes, products from reprocessing when it's recycled does not completely offset the costs of the operations necessary to do it. So that's the second reason. The third one is the waste management issues, and this depends very much on the linkage between the waste disposal strategy of a country and the fuel cycle strategy. It depends upon the geologic medium. It depends upon the availability of land and the siting. So it's unique to each country that's trying to do disposal. You can get a huge volume reduction from doing reprocessing and recycling. It's harder to get a heat reduction, and heat is often the driving force in the repository. And if you don't get that heat reduction as well, then it offsets the volume reduction, and you get very, very little overall benefit in the repository. So there is a trade-off that can be made there. Radiotoxicity is an issue, like Andrew said, at least in the United States. The dose from the repository is the regulatory factor, but that's not the factor used by every country in terms of making a judgment about their waste management. So there are some potential advantages that can be gained from recycling. in the area of reduction of the actinides. What you do, particularly if you do early recycling, is you reduce dramatically the plutonium content of the waste, which, and of course the plutonium is the largest actinide in the mix. But if you do it early, you also reduce americium and neptunium because they come from the decay of plutonium-241. So there is an overall benefit associated with waste management. If you don't do it early, however, and all of your 241 plutonium decays, now you've got all the americium and the neptunium, and so later reprocessing, while easier because of a lower heat load and lower criticality concerns, you still have a hotter mix of isotopes to deal with. Finally, there's non-proliferation, and in this area, I will make a perhaps controversial statement. There are both positive non-proliferation benefits to doing recycle, and there are negative benefits, or I guess negative consequences. Clearly, the recycling of the plutonium, to the extent that you destroy plutonium atoms and you denature the remaining atoms of plutonium so they're less useful for explosive purposes, that's a positive contribution. The negative contribution, however, is in order to get those benefits, you have to go through a period of time where you have separated material which has the potential to be diverted, and therefore you bring into the picture the need for extensive safeguards and security which might not be necessary otherwise, at least not for the first century maybe when the fuel is nominally self-protecting. And I'll address that a little bit later. So those are the reasons. No single one of those reasons by itself will, in my mind, justify doing reprocess and recycle. It requires a combination of factors, of 2 or 3 of those, in order to drive a nation to make the decision that they want to do recycling rather than to throw away the spent fuel. Now, how does one do it? There are 2 fundamental approaches to doing the reprocessing. One is aqueous reprocessing, chemical separations, which were unfortunately pioneered during the Cold War years, and they come tainted with the fact that they were used for weapons. The second one is electrometallurgical separations, or pyroprocessing, and that is far less developed than aqueous reprocessing. Both of these processes separate isotopes. And from the perspective of proliferation concerns, if you have a technology which makes it possible to move one set of isotopes in one direction and another set another one, you have a potential proliferation concern. And so in both cases, you need to be worried about safeguards and security. Electrometallurgical processing is not a solution to the problems associated with reprocessing by itself. Now, of course, aqueous is proven because it's been used in many places around the world. Pyroprocessing requires a good deal more development. It looks promising on laboratory scale, but it hasn't been scaled up to industrial commercial size. And it's not obvious how this is going to work, although there are programs in place, including cooperation between the U.S. and Korea now, to see what could be done with this particular technology. When? I personally don't think timing is critical, and the reason I say that is that safe useful storage has been demonstrated in a variety of ways around the world. We know how to do it. We can do it. Obviously, Fukushima has brought into the picture some new concerns about spent fuel storage, but I would argue that some of the more extreme arguments I've seen that Fukushima demonstrates a need to empty pools, first of all, makes no technical and logistical sense, and I just don't see this as a driver either to push in the direction necessarily of reprocessing or of making a massive, very quick shift into dry storage. So as I said earlier, the earlier reprocessing reduces some of the actinides, later reprocessing is somewhat easier. So lack of spent fuel storage capability by itself, again, this is not an adequate reason to do reprocessing. Where? The United States is probably, along with Russia, the best examples of how not to do it. The Cold War drove both countries into a program of very accelerated secret programs to produce as much plutonium and HEU as they possibly could to make all of these weapons. They did it in a very, very dirty fashion, and unfortunately both countries are paying the price today. It's going to take us decades, if not centuries, to clean up some of our former weapon sites in the United States because of the sloppy way in which this was done. In the commercial area, we weren't much better in the United States. We had 3 reprocessing plants built. First, West Valley in New York, which worked but was old technology, and it died because of changes in the regulatory climate. We then had Morris, Illinois, built by GE, and there's a lesson to be learned here because they wanted to avoid Purex, and they came along with a brand new process called Aquafluor, which worked very, very well in the laboratory. They built a whole plant up there, turned it on, tested it with uranium, only to learn that they couldn't scale it up. So they abandoned the thing. This was a technical failure. The third failure, of course, was the Barnwell plant, which was a plant built in South Carolina, and that one died over policy issues when President Carter decided to abandon commercial reprocessing. And so we have 3 cases of failed attempts in the United States to do recycling. Now, obviously, that's not the case everywhere in the world. France has had exactly the opposite experience. Areva has been successfully doing reprocessing and recycling now for about 40 years. It works. It's done quite cleanly compared to the way the weapons program has gone. It's done in a relatively economical fashion, and it serves a purpose in France to minimize the quantity of plutonium and actinides that are going to go into the repository. I would add, and please don't take this as a commercial, but the size of the La Hague facility in France is such that there's about 40 to 45% unused capacity at the moment. So for someone embarking on the concept of I need to build a reprocessing plant because I want to recycle my fuel, they don't have to do that. They can buy the service from Areva. They could also buy it from the UK. Conceivably, they could buy it from Russia as well. So this is one of the reasons that I would never argue that every country with a nuclear program has to have its own recycling facilities. This makes absolutely no sense. And in fact, the investment in a recycling complex is so large, and I do mean large, I mean on the order of 4 to 5 nuclear power plants, which are already a very, very big investment. That type of investment can only be justified with a very, very large domestic program which will provide enough feed to guarantee use of the facility. Otherwise, you're making a huge investment and you will never get a return on that investment. And so countries like Finland, even Sweden, the programs there would never be large enough to justify a domestic recycling complex. Other countries are in a different situation. So I think I will just stop there. That's just a quick overview of some of the considerations that would go into the decisions. And in each case, these are decisions made at a national level, and each country with a nuclear power program is going to have to make a decision about whether they want to treat the used fuel as a resource or a waste. And the most important thing of all, and I think it's been said already by the previous 2 speakers, you cannot eliminate the repository by doing recycling. You still need a repository, and this is one of the things we always need to remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I just want to briefly poke you a little bit on this issue of scale, economies of scale. In enrichment, it's often said, well, gee, to make a domestic enrichment plant profitable, you need at least 15 or, I don't know what the number is. Different people have different numbers, 15 or 20 big nuclear power plants. Are you suggesting that's also similar for reprocessing?
Not only is it similar, it's even more so with reprocessing. I don't think that 15 plants domestically is enough to justify a reprocessing facility. I think you're looking more on the order of 20 to 30 to 40 before it can really be anything close to an economical alternative. And there's one other difference that I would add that I think is very important. In the case of enrichment, unless you're running heavy water reactors, then you need to do enrichment. And there is a worldwide commercial market for enrichment. And the enrichers in the world today are not doing enrichment solely for their own domestic facilities. There is a thriving commercial market in enrichment services, and a very competitive market. And so one might make the case that they wanted to build an enrichment plant in order to enrich for others and to make profits from it. And actually, I could make that business case. I can't do the same thing with recycling at the present time.
Okay. Thank you. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Charles McCombie.
Thank you, Sharon. Well, going last is the usual problem that most of it's been said. So what I'll try to do is go through and pick out the issues which are especially important to me, because one of my main interests is in the problems facing small and new nuclear countries. And there are lots of them. And what happens in the small and new nuclear countries affects all of us, even the big and old nuclear countries. The second thing I'll try to do is pick out things where I disagree with my colleagues in case we can start an argument, which is always more fun. Very briefly to the storage. Of course, it's been said, storage. We need storage. It's a fait accompli. We're going to need it for a long time. The only issue is going to be facing people is what type of storage, what technology to use. In there, I have a little bit first quasi-disagreement. I also thought that it was equally choose wet or dry. They're both proven technologies. In fact, wet more proven and so on. But Fukushima has had an impact there. I've advised single reactor programs in the past. Why don't you build a big pool that you can keep all your fuel in for 60 years? That's the cheapest and easiest way. I think after Fukushima, a big pool with 60 years of accumulated fuel looks less attractive than it did. But storage keeps the options open. That was mentioned as well. That's good news. And it postpones a really expensive part of the system. It postpones building a repository. Maybe even more important, it postpones the heartache associated with trying to build a repository, and I'll come to that afterwards. So that's a tempting issue that's tempted people in many countries, including the USA. Why not push it off into the future? The last point I want to make in storage, though, is that maybe that's not so easy, because the issue of implementing storage, if you don't have a credible disposal program, I'll come to that, has proven to be a stumbling block in many countries around the world, including, I think, here where we are now. So that's the storage issues. In the reprocessing issues, I really like to hear Alan when he talks about reprocessing, because it's an antidote to my usually hearing Areva people only. Yeah. And that was a very fair plus and minuses of it. The big thing about reprocessing, why it was invented, is it saves uranium. And I think there's an extra element there that wasn't explicitly mentioned. If 100 years ago we'd found oil for the first time and said, hey, this is great stuff, let's use it all up in the next 100 years, how responsible would that have looked? So even if you do have 100 years, how responsible does it look to treat uranium like that? Reprocessing, another part that wasn't mentioned, the big driver for reprocessing in some countries was it's the only way to get rid of your fuel. Italy is sending fuel off now to be reprocessed in the UK because there's nothing else they can do with it and they have to get it off the site. The big issue about reprocessing, of course, that doesn't avoid the disposal facility, as Alan said. The technical advantages and disadvantages have been misstated on both sides all the time. Changing the volume, changing the waste form, changing the activity. They've all got two sides to the argument. I'll just leave it at that just now, yeah? And the last point that gives problems to reprocessing right now, of course, is that it's two things. Two attributes of reprocessing. One is that it's very expensive, and two, it's postponable. Now, and who puts out money if they don't have to put out money? So that's what's really suffering from. The last part, geological disposal, as quick as I can, we need it whatever fuel cycle we have. And this really annoys me sometimes with my colleagues. In fact, as a physicist, I'm allowed to criticize physicists, and they're toys for the boys physicists who went around overstating also this, that if we use that next fuel cycle, we won't need a geological disposal facility. It's not true. We need it anyway, and I think you said that as well, Alan, and we have to really... But we don't need it urgently in a technical sense, as I said. We do need it. It's an important, if not urgent thing. We need it for safety reasons, for security reasons, and last not least, for public acceptance. So that even if we don't have it, we have to have a credible strategy leading towards it. Credible being the important word. What do I mean by credible? I mean we have to have the technology, and we do. It's being demonstrated one-to-one in some places in the world. You heard about that. You have to have the funding prepared, set aside, ring-fenced, not being used for other things, as in some countries that shall not be named, like the US. So you have to have the funding, and last and not least, you have to have a credible strategy leading you towards siting. And as Jussi said, that's the big issue. The small countries that I deal with, in fact, they have different options. You can have a national strategy. Again, how big do I have to be to have a national repository? Jussi, I think, used 3 billion euros, I think, is your cost. But roughly, even the smallest repository costs about the same as a reactor. Yeah. So if you only have one reactor, like the new countries, you're looking at a double cost item. Yeah. So that's really important there. The other things that new and small countries can do is they can look at multinational options, of which there are 3. Some big friendly country can take it back for you. There's no big friendly countries out there offering that right now. Or else you can partner with other people in the same situation. Again, there are no partnership things actually working, but very briefly, there is one promising initiative in Europe, which is a European Repository Development Organization, where the small countries in Europe are looking at the possibilities of coordinating and not having all having a repository, maybe one or maybe 2, but not all having it. And this concept could be applied to other parts of the world, primarily to the Gulf region or maybe to parts of Asia. In the Gulf region, they are also looking at already the UAE, which is the big customer of Korea right now, has actually declared it will have a dual-track disposal strategy, which means it will look at a national program, but will also look at the option of a multinational approach. And the Gulf Coordinating Council has just done a first study on that, and we're involved in some of these. So these are the options facing the small countries. Technologically, they have the same problems. The borehole idea, which has come out of the blue again in a big way, seems to me to be only for special kinds of waste if you're looking at it in a big country like the US, but for small countries it could be more applicable. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. I miscalculated on the time, and we only have about 15 minutes for questions. So keep your questions brief, please, and make them questions. First, Gary.
I've got a question for Dr. Hansen and for any of the others. Can you talk a little bit more about the potential advantages of the use of pyroprocessing as opposed to aqueous, and also talk about, you mentioned the technical complexities of scaling up from R&D or pilot scale to industrial. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of those challenges are for pyro? Thank you.
I can contribute actually quite little on this. I'm not a chemical engineer, and I have not been involved in the fast reactor program in the U.S. where most of the work on pyroprocessing has been done. From a fundamental point of view, one of the difficulties with regard to scaling up is that you can do aqueous in a continuous manner, but pyroprocessing has to be done in a batch manner, and this makes a very, very big difference with regard to the cost and the way you go about doing it. You're going to still end up with a different set of wastes than you would have otherwise. Pyroprocessing is probably more beneficial in a fast reactor situation, and particularly if you're making metal fuel, since you've got a material, you don't have to go through the oxidation. The trouble with pyroprocessing right now is, first of all, you have to go through a deoxidation, then you have to reoxide it in order to put it back into reactor. So you have additional steps. It really doesn't fit very well with a light water technology. Scaling up, I can't begin to tell you the differences between doing something in a laboratory with scientists and trying to go out and build it on a commercial scale and make it work. We've had a lot of experience as AREVA with trying to build big industrial facilities. We make them work in the end, but the pain necessary to go through and make things work is enormous. it's only because of the 40 years of experience at La Hague that we're successfully doing aqueous processing today. It didn't start out that easy, and making the fuel from that was even more difficult. That fuel, and this will be my last comment here, making fuel in the end is the most important step, because that's what goes into the reactors. And making fuel with a higher actinide content in it than what we have right now is a very, very difficult task, which might make it not commercially viable.
Okay. Thank you. This gentleman here in the center.
Yeah, I have, can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I'm going to be speaking about this tomorrow at the peaceful use of nuclear energy panel. My name is Tom Lockyer from RAND. And I have a question about, a sort of multi-part question about motivations for reprocessing. And I'm curious about, you make the case, I think it was Alan, you made the case for, you want to have security for energy, for uranium supply, so you don't want to have to buy it. And yet, it's okay to buy reprocessing. So why not just buy the uranium in the first place, where you can go to Canada or Australia or, quite a few places? The second part is, has anyone ever really worried about the volume of waste? I mean, even if you could set this stuff out for 200 years and let it cool down and really reduce the volume, has that ever been, I mean, all the problems of building repository, I've never heard anyone talk about the volume being an issue. I mean, if you've got 60,000 tons or 6,000 tons, that doesn't seem to me to be a really compelling driver about how you build a repository.
And let me add one more question. Of all that uranium that's been reprocessed, has it been used?
Well, that was my third, that's on my list.
Okay, let's, yeah, right. I think the answer is not. It hasn't been used.
The answer is that all of the recovered material from the overseas reprocessors has been used. And EDF, not all of it has been used, but some of it is being recycled in 4 reactors at the moment after re-enrichment. And when we finish the new enrichment plant in France, there will be a separate facility specifically dedicated to re-enrichment of that material, and then it will be used in far greater quantities.
Is that economical with using fresh uranium?
Depends upon the price of uranium, and economical is an open question. If that means, is it cheaper? It depends upon the price of uranium and the cost of re-enrichment.
Okay. Did anyone else have a comment?
Just the volume issue, I think I tend to agree with you that the volume is certainly not a major issue. The volume has been discussed in different programs because people have artificially assumed particular volume upper limits on particular host rock formations. But if you're willing to be versatile in your repository design, if you're willing to look widely for sites, I don't think the volume is a big issue.
And I guess just to clarify, when I say volume, I mean repository volume.
Yeah, I mean they say.
Yucca Mountain had a legislated capacity of approximately 63,000 metric tons for spent fuel. That was often held up as a repository volume limit, if you will. And one that we would already have reached given this year. So oftentimes you'll hear it, but again, it's just a legislative capacity. It's not a technical capacity. And then the last time we checked, given the economic situation in Nevada, land's pretty cheap, so you can expand the region pretty easily.
So I have 4 people on my list. We're going to take 2 questions at a time, but you really need to be brief. So please do not give us a dissertation about your views, just a real question. First Henry, and then Haim, then Yangsu, and this gentleman over here. So Henry is all the way in the back.
Okay.
Yeah, if people are willing to start.
This was a great panel, by the way. 3 questions. I'll be brief.
Quickly.
Okay, Sharon, for you, because nobody talked about dry cask, can anyone speak to the legal and economic barriers to getting more of the stuff out of the pools into dry cask? Second question, isn't the reactor kind of radioactive? What is the pacing event there? How long does it take to decommission a reactor presumably that's the time you got to do something with this spent fuel. Nobody spoke about that. I don't know what the number is. Finally, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal that a fellow named Goshi Hosono, I may have mispronounced that, who's a top aide to the Prime Minister in Japan, said that Japan should review the reprocessing program for safety reasons. Can anyone explain what those concerns might be? The story was real brief, didn't explain.
Great questions. Henry, Andrew, do you want to talk about dry cask storage? Or,
just briefly, at least for the U.S. situation, is that dry cask costs real money to a profit-making industry to move from spent fuel pools to dry cask storage. Nominally, you can't do this until about 5 years because of the need for active cooling versus passive cooling. But after that, the only detriment to it, if you will, or resistance to it, is the incurred cost. With the U.S. situation where the U.S. government failed to take title to the fuel in time, there have been lawsuits that have been successful in recovering those costs. So there's a lowered barrier, but still a barrier. There's also quite a worker exposure set of issues that have to be dealt with in managing a workforce, the exposures that it gets when it moves this material to dry cask storage. So there's some barrier to it, but it's not a particular, it's not fatal at this point.
Yeah, I would just add, I have a program with me. We just did a report on spent fuel management and marketizing it. One of the problems when you have a reactor that's decommissioned and you have spent fuel sitting there, you're obviously paying money, and it becomes expensive. So those are that's the spent fuel that you should move out first. In the United States, because of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the government owns it. So we have a lot of barriers that we need to work around. Does anybody have a comment on reviewing the safety of the reprocessing program in Japan?
The only thing I heard was it was not so much the safety of the reprocessing, it was the issue that the Wakasho plant is not too far from Fukushima, if you will, and there were concerns about its susceptibility to similar accidents, that sort of thing. I didn't hear anything about the safety of reprocessing, but just the particular location, but I could be wrong.
The only thing I would add is that obviously at a reprocessing plant, including Wakasho, the front end of the plant is a wet pool storage. Usually it's bigger in terms of capacity than at the individual reactors. So if you're worried about the spent fuel at a reactor, you're going to worry about it at a reprocessing plant as well.
Okay, we have questions from Chaim. Yeah.
Okay, it's a question for Alan. Alan, could you elaborate a little bit more about the barriers for commercial reprocessing, plant size and cost? And would you see a small or medium-sized reprocessing plant justified on economic grounds in the commercial world?
The answer to the second question is no. The scaling of a reprocessing plant, it scales even faster than a reactor does. It's going to cost you billions of dollars to make one that does 100 metric tons throughput, 400, 800, 2,000. So there's a real incentive to make the plant big, more so than even with a reactor, and certainly more so than with an enrichment facility, which is truly modular.
How big is commercial and how much it costs?
Billions.
Billions for sure, tens of billions in reality. Our experience in France has been that 800 is a good size, and certainly 800 metric tons a year throughput is scalable. If you're going to do it again, I would be somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 for a single plant. That would scale even better. But when you start going down from 800, I think it's almost impossible to justify it from a cost-benefit point of view.
Okay, Young-Soo, very briefly.
Hi. I'd like to ask a question to Alan, as usually. And we always have some disagreement and agreement. Actually, I have some question about the price of the pyroprocessing. For example, if you are talking about building a new power plant in the United States, it costs more than $10 billion US. But in Korea, we can build it by $2.5 billion. So sometimes there is so big difference in price tag. So So I'm not really sure whether we can actually, at this moment, compare the price of the wet process with the dry process.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, you mentioned that there might be some problem of the dry process about the capacity. But if you take a look at the study by old Algon and some recent progress in Kyrie, then I think we don't have any big problem to increase the capacity of the commercial plant if you really would like to go for the commercial facilities. Also, if we go for the pyroprocessing, as Andrew already mentioned, what's really important for the waste disposal is the dose in most countries. And throughout some oxidation process, we can get rid of all lot of the mobile nuclide. Also, we can, as you know, we can separate all the decay heat generating nuclide without any big problem.
I think in part, I'm sorry, we are running out of time, but also we're going to cover these issues in the panel. I think that's tomorrow. Can we save some of this discussion? Because I think you'll be able to get into more detail.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is that it's very case specific. Some technology might be working for the United States, some technology might be working for the European Union, but for Korean case, we might end up with a different story.
So this
I agree completely.
Gentleman has been waiting very patiently. The briefest of questions, and then we'll thank our panelists.
Yes, I am Dominique Ganesh from France, Nuclear Consulting. I promise to be very brief because it's not a question, it's a comment. Very brief comment. I think more than the volume of waste, which was given as an argument for reprocessing, from my feeling is that there's a much more important argument for reprocessing is the waste form. The waste form, I mean, the spent fuel, a fuel is designed and qualified to produce energy in a reactor. It is not designed for a final repository and to withstand, the condition of a repository for 1,000 years. You need a container. This is not the case of vitrified waste from reprocessing. Vitrified waste are products which are designed to withstand the condition of a long-term repository underground. This is as simple as this.
Thank you for your comment. Okay, any final words?
One statement to kind of disagree. Spent fuel has had a hard life behind it. It's been in conditions that glass could never hold on to. The glass was not designed for waste disposal. The glass was designed to easily incorporate as many fishing projects as possible at a time when people hadn't even worked out what needed for disposal. Glass is a really very good waste form. So is spent fuel, in my opinion.
This is not the case of the safety authority in France. Safety authority do not agree with this kind of policy.
Other countries don't have big reprocessing nationally.
So I want to thank the panel. You've done a fantastic job of going through some very difficult issues in a very short time, and thank you to all of you for your questions.